Hello, friends. My name is Pastor Kate, and I get to serve as the pastor here at Ronald United. And this is such a gift to listen and just be bathed in the wisdom of our speaker today. And I want to be very clear that we are merely facilitators and offer steep gratitude to the practicing church. Let me hear a whoop whoop if you're practicing church. Whoop whoop. Thank you to all the practicing church congregants who are our neighbors and who knew that we would be really interested in this and who thought, let's do a mashup and let's do this together. Oh, thank you. Well, what I would like to do is I would just like to tell you a little bit about the building so you can be comfortable in this space. Our speaker is so wonderfully interdisciplinary trained on so many different schools of thought that there has been a bit of a pattern where even though we set like 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., sometimes people are here for a minute, really enjoying themselves. And I want you to know how to navigate the space to meet your needs. So just a couple of things for you to know. What I want you to know is that in this building, on this floor, right on the other side of this wall, we have a single stall bathroom for all genders that's ADA accessible. You're welcome to use that bathroom, no matter your own identity, but we want you to please defer to the people who may need to use that bathroom because of their identity. We also have gendered bathrooms at the end of this hallway and more bathrooms downstairs. And we're so glad that you're here. And I confirmed with our speaker that he won't be offended if you are just an adult and manage your body independently. So go to the bathroom when you want. We won't have a formal intermission or anything of that nature. We're just going to flow. So if you really have to go, you just got to run for it. There will be no hall monitors checking for runners. We also wanted to let you know that we are grateful that our speaker has allowed us to record today. So you're going to hear a lot of information, and I'm guessing that you showed up here because you're familiar with some of it, and you know you might get uncomfortable, and you know you might have to hear some things more than once, more than twice. And so we are so grateful that our speaker has a YouTube channel, books, publications, and this event you're at tonight will also be recorded and available later. What are your feelings about them taking pictures of your slides? We got thumbs up. If you see a slide that you need to think more about, you have permission to take a photograph of it. If you repost it, though, make sure you tag the actual creator of that content. And in this way, even if you have the recording, if you want the correlating slide, then we're going to put it over here. We will continue to work at the tech station, and I apologize that this monitor just doesn't want to play tonight. So I'm letting you know that just in case you're interested in maybe moving closer to this monitor, that's okay. If you end up going, that's too far away and the other one's not turning on, and my apologies for that. We also wanted to let you know that there will be an opportunity given time for you to give questions to our speaker. In order to ask a question, you'll wave your hand, we'll give you an index card, you write it down, hold the card up in the air, and then we bring you a microphone. And we'll just be like, make sure it's a question, not a statement or a thesis. Because I'm sure you're all very interesting, but we were here to hear Mark. So, so just wave that card up in the air, and then a microphone will be brought to you at the appointed time. And then I wanted to say, friends, our speaker is come today with no guarantees of anything whatsoever. Paid for their flight by themselves, their stay by themselves, all their expenses and travels by themselves. So later you'll receive another invitation. Please help him feel comfortable returning to the Pacific Northwest, knowing that we are eager to learn by honoring his time with a gift and contribution. If you are giving in cash dollars, we'll have a bucket for that. We also have a Venmo code, a GoFundMe, and all that if you're a digital giver. And that was available online, and we'll also put those up and about. So feel free, there'll be more flyers at the back table if you want to grab a card and do that as he's speaking. So that's kind of the housekeeping. So what I would like to do is do a land acknowledgement. This is the land acknowledgement that this church reads every week. And after this land acknowledgement, we're going to get right to welcoming our speaker. Yay! So we did it. We made it to now. This is our land acknowledgement. And on the third slide, there will be letters in bold. When you see letters in bold at a United Methodist Church, it means it's a sing-along. Just kidding, you don't have to sing. But you're invited to recite those words with us if they feel true to your heart and you're not at all obligated. So please join me in our land acknowledgement. This land was taken from the Coast Salish people, where their role as caregivers for this ground remains a spiritual practice and sacred. And would you put the mouse on the PowerPoint for me? Thank you. Thanks. We honor and recognize that the forced removal of Indigenous people is an oppression of their religious rights and their basic dignity, and the pain is ongoing. For those who have been and still are, thank you, commodified, exploited, and oppressed of their dignity, we pray to speak the truth about the abuses, as well as our compliance with them. May we work to find ways to repent of and repair the damage done. Amen. May it be so. Well, I have the great honor of inviting up our speaker, and I have to tell you that I'm not wearing my collar right now, and I'm at the place where I work, but I'm not working, so I can just fangirl. Sorry to all my parishioners, I'm so stoked. When I was going through seminary, this was one of the recommended readings to really mess with anybody who showed up and thought they already had all the answers. The book Unsettling Truths was, how would you put it? Unsettling? Unsettling. And so healing. In equal parts disruptive, and in equal parts I went, that actually, something in me knows that's true. I'm appointed here at this church where up until from 1909 all the way till 1993, there were only white men pastors. I'm so grateful to get to serve in this incredibly diverse church that gathers here. And I can't think of a better place to have this truth be told. But in places that have been dedicated in some part, and in some cases, large part, and in a lot of cases, informed, not even ignorant, complicity. It's appropriate that this pulpit and this building that's been dedicated to truth-telling tell the truth yet again, even when it feels scary and even when it feels uncomfortable. And may we have the courage to let our spirits open. And I'm a good one to listen in, because even though I might be some radical liberal now, the heresy of empire and Christendom, and thereby white supremacy, was definitely, unquestionably, the bedrock of my religious formation. I was one of those people. And today, post-cult, post-fundamentalism, post all the evil that I helped co-create in the name of Christ, for the glory of God, I am still recovering. I have to keep yielding and humbling myself over and over and over to what I've been conditioned to be complicit in. And I continue, to my dismay, to discover ways where I am part of the problem. But this is holy work when we get to uncover what those things are. And so I continue to engage in my very necessary conversion. And so with all that in mind, this pastor stands before you making public confession. Not only was I a very active recruiter in the problem, I'm still in recovery. I am. And so it is with deep apology and ongoing repentance and humility that I welcome my own guide, my own teacher, and my own elder, Mark Charles. Bless us. Please receive him.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for a chance to be here and talk to all of you. Can people in the back hear me okay? I want to just make sure this sounds all right. Okay. Well, yat Mark Charles Yinishya, Sin Bake Dene Nishle, Dotor Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bake Dene Dasha Che, Dotor Chitni Dasha Nala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin Bake Dene Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake, and my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I'm grateful that we already have offered a land acknowledgement. I feel always best for the people who are living on these lands to acknowledge the lands that they're living on. And so I'm grateful that the church and the congregation here has written a land acknowledgement and used that regularly. Let me see if this is going to work okay. Is it? Oh,
Okay, now it works.
now it works. Okay, there we go. So I come from the Navajo Nation. It's in the Southwest. Our 4 sacred mountains are there, and there's also the lands of the Diné, my people, the Zuni, the Hopi, and the Ute. I live currently in Washington, or Washington, D.C., which is the land of the Piscataway. And we are here in the Pacific Northwest on the lands of the Cayuse, the Umatilla, the Walla Walla, the Sioux Squamish, the Snowish-Mish, and the Duwamish. And I think I mispronounced that second last one, but I always like to acknowledge the people whose land I'm on. It's important that we remember that these lands were not discovered. And there were people living here, hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, burying their dead here, long before Columbus got lost at sea or Lewis and Clark made a trek across the continent. And many of these people are still here. And so it's important that we acknowledge the people whose lands we are walking on. It's important that we remember there is a history and a story to these lands that far predate white European colonizers arriving on these lands. And it's important that we walk humbly on these lands as we make our living and feed our families and live our lives, knowing that there is a story that many of us are not very well aware of. Now, I need to warn you because over the next, I'm going to say 90 minutes, but I have to let you know, I've been giving this talk for about 4 or 5 months now. I don't think I've made 90 minutes yet. I'm getting closer, but it's always a bit, I change things up and I always try a few new things every time I give this talk. And my goal is for 90 minutes, 75 to 90 minutes, and then about a 20 to 30 minute time for Q&A at the end. And so that's what we're shooting for. But over the next 90 minutes, I can pretty much promise you I'm going to offend almost everybody in the room. I'm not doing it on purpose, but I'm also not avoiding things that I know will be offensive. If you feel like I'm picking on you too much and your neighbor is getting off scot-free, just sit tight. I make a bipartisan critique. So within a few minutes, they will be squirming just as much as you are, and I am pretty fair to both sides. I also need to warn you that there are a few things I'm going to talk about that may be triggering. I'm going to talk about the Bible. And if you've read the Bible, The Bible's triggering, right? Not the Sunday school version of the Bible where Lot was a good man, but the Bible where Lot pimped out his daughters and Abraham raped his wife's servant. That Bible. We're going to be talking about that Bible today. And so you need to be warned. There will be some triggering things being said during this talk. I also need to let you know that there may be times where you will look for a polite way to walk out, even though you don't need to use the bathroom. There may be times where you want to throw something at me, resist that urge, but stay engaged. Because there's some things that as citizens of the United States of America, as people living on these lands, as people who belong to churches and are part of congregations and call themselves Christians, there are some things that we need to learn how to wrestle with. And we need to talk about some things very honestly. And we're going to get to a better place. But first, we have to take some pretty long, hard looks in a mirror that is uncomfortable for most of us. The name of my talk is Christian Nationalism, Creation Stories, and Corn. Now, some of you might already be triggered. And you might be thinking, Mr. Charles, did you talk to your AI and did you ask your AI to give you a picture of Donald Trump dressed patriotically, but looking like Jesus and eating an ear of corn? Relax. Even though I might have asked my AI for that, that's not what it gave me. My AI told me it wasn't allowed to make a picture like that, but it had a suggestion for me. Now, I'm going to be talking about AI a little bit throughout this talk. I really like AI. I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s. While most of my friends and my neighbors were thinking about flying cars and space travel and time travel, I was watching Knight Rider. And I love Knight Rider because Michael Knight had a car that was witty and he could talk to it. And I looked forward to the day when I could talk to my car, talk to my computer. And with AI, we're just about there. I can talk to my computer and it answers me back. And it's getting better and better. The problem is AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. And it's very confident about the things that it knows and even the things that it thinks it knows. And it will lie blatantly to your face. And if you don't know what your AI doesn't know, you're going to think it's telling you the truth. And so I wanted to have a voice for my AI. So choosing the voice for your AI is a very important task if you ever use AI. And you don't type to it, you want to talk to it, right? You're given a range of voices that you can choose. They always have a British accent, or there's female voices. There's usually at least one kind of ethnic sounding voice in the mix. And then there's a bunch of white male voices. And I decided I didn't want to have a female voice, and I didn't want to have an ethnic voice. I wanted to have a voice that I could listen to, but I wouldn't necessarily trust. And so I chose the white, malest voice I could possibly find. So no matter how confidently my AI said something to me, I would always be thinking, you could be lying to me. And you're not even going to sweat or tell me about it. And so my AI, when I said, give me a photo of Donald Trump dressed patriotically but looking like Jesus eating a corn on the cob, my AI said, I can't do that. I'm not allowed to do something that might make fun of people politically or make fun of people's religions. It said, but what I can do is I can give you a satirical illustration of a man with golden hair wearing a red, white, and blue robe like a biblical figure, eating corn on the cob in a rural American setting. The background will include waving fields of corn and a glowing sunset evoking classic Americana. And we're going to call this picture Biblical Americana at Sunset. So that's what this is. If I wanted to put Donald Trump on my slides, I would have even found another way to get around my AI. And I probably would have said, well, why don't you show me an image of Donald Trump pretending to be a Christian and hugging a flag? And it would bring up all these images right here. I could choose these images and find this image taken by a White House staffer at the CPAC conference in 2019, where Donald Trump, after pretending to be a Christian, did very much hug his AI. And now some of you may be triggered and say, Mr. Charles, how can you judge him and say he's not a Christian or he's pretending to be a Christian? Don't you know you're going against what your Bible even says? Well, you have to have evidence. And this is not the room for the intervention for MAGA cult followers. That's another room we'll go to later. This is a different intervention. Did I just say that out loud? Yes, this is an intervention. We are having an intervention, but this is not the Donald Trump is Jesus, the MAGA intervention. This is a different intervention that I'm going to be talking to you about. But I could have taken this image and I could have zoomed in on a little bit and I could have put it as the background of my graphic and called this my Christian nationalism, creation stories, and corn graphic. But I decided not to do that. So instead, we're going to go with Biblical Americana at Sunset, and we're going to just use it as it seems appropriate for our Christian nationalism, creation stories, and corn. Now, one of the challenges that we have as citizens of the United States is that pretty much all of our media leans to the left. Almost all of it. Obviously, MSNBC and CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, all of those lean to the left. NPR, PBS, even AP lean to the left. There are precious few news media on a national level that are mainstream that lean to the right. One of the reasons Fox News is one of the largest media outlets out there for news is because they cater to almost the entire right wing of our political parties. The Wall Street Journal has a bit of that slice. There's a few others, but mostly it's those two, whereas the left has almost all of the other mainstream media. And because of this, most of what we're fed in our daily lives is left-leaning news. Now, most of us are fairly well aware of the right-wing news bubble, but there is also a left-leaning news bubble. And if you're not aware of it, and if you're not paying attention to it, you're going to miss some things as you go through and catch up on what's going on throughout the day. So a few years ago, back in 2020, we had a public lynching in this country with the choking of George Floyd to death. All of us watched it on social media as the video was played over and over and over again. Now, this was happening during the 2020 presidential campaign. I was actually running for president at the time. I was an independent candidate running in the 2020 election. The theme of my campaign was I wanted to build a nation where we, the people, for the first time might actually mean all the people. One of the primary platforms of our planks of my platform was I thought we needed to work towards a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. a conversation I thought would need to be on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa and Rwanda and in Canada. But I wasn't going to call ours Truth and Reconciliation because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't accurate. So I was going to call ours Truth and Conciliation, with the understanding that we had to mediate these differences for the very first time. And part of the main foundation of my platform was that we had to address things at a foundational level. And as horrifying as it was to watch what the police did to George Floyd in Minneapolis, I yearned for some good to come out of it with a national dialogue on what we are doing through our police system and through our law enforcement to our minorities and people of color and other people from the margins. And I was waiting for the news media to come and start talking to me and finally picking up on some of the things I've been talking about through the entire campaign, and no one said anything. Now, the two major candidates in that election, who were both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they both responded to what happened. Do you remember this? Trump, his response to the murder of George Floyd, who was choked to death, was he thought that maybe perhaps we might want to possibly think about banning one or two types of chokehold. That was his solution. And remember what Joe Biden's solution was? Well, Joe Biden's solution was he thought we should train our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. That was his solution. So a few weeks later, when Jacob Blake was shot 9 times in the back, but not lethally, they got their way, right? That's what they wanted. He wasn't choked, nor was he shot to his death. That was the solution these two candidates advocated for. And yet, clearly, this was not justice. Clearly, this was still systemically wrong, and we didn't know what we needed to do about it. Now, I live in Washington, D.C., and during that time, there was protests going on all around the country. People were protesting law enforcement. They were protesting what was happening in our nation. And there's a park called Lafayette Park. It's right across the street from the White House. And there's protests going on in that park every single day. Now, one of the challenges we face as a nation, because our primary media sources lean to the left, is that most of us believe that Christian nationalism is a partisan problem, and that it is the right, the GOP, and specifically Donald Trump, who are Christian nationalists. And if we could just get that party out of power, vote Donald Trump out of office, we would solve this problem. So during these protests, early on, and this was on June 1st of 2020, that morning, law enforcement went into Lafayette Park and they aggressively cleared the park, aggressively cleared it. It was empty. A few hours later, Donald Trump walked out of the White House, walked through the park, went to the church across the street, held up his Bible, upside down at first, and turned it right side up, took this picture, which has been etched in all of our brains, and then said almost nothing and walked back across the park and into the White House. And he was immediately called out for exactly what he was doing, right? Which is he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists. That's what he was doing, and he was immediately called out by all of the news outlets about what he was doing. and he was decried for that. Now, in the election, in the 2020 election, Joe Biden was running as the anti-Donald Trump, right? Joe Biden was going to be different. He was going to bring statesmanship back into the White House. He was not going to do his foreign policy over Twitter, right? He promised he would speak in a more complete sentence structure. He was going to bring statesmanship back into the White House. And he won the election. And in early 2021, Joe Biden was tested. And he was tested because there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan at the international airport there on August 26th of 2021. It was such a horrific attack that killed several US service members that he actually had to make a statement. And so that evening, he made a statement. And in his statement, this is what he said. To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command. Now, there's been another global leader who's spoken very similarly like this over the past several years, and that's been President Putin from Russia. During the war in Ukraine, he has warned us and NATO that if we put any boots on the ground in Russia, he will respond with every measure at his command to defend his nation from our soldiers. And we have decried that. How dare you talk that way, Mr. Putin? You are a nuclear power. You are threatening nuclear warfare. How dare you speak that way? When our own president spoke the exact same way just 4 years ago. And if I didn't tell you this was Joe Biden, you all would have thought it was Donald Trump, because when Joe Biden is scared, he talks exactly like Donald Trump does. They both speak exactly the same when they get frightened. Sentence structure and everything. He went on in his speech. He said, I want to thank the Secretary of Defense and the military leadership at the Pentagon and all the commanders in the field. There has been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission and the best way to achieve those objectives. He then went on to say, I also want to thank the Secretary of Defense and the military leadership at the Pentagon and all the commanders in the field. There's been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission. And then he said, those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah, when the Lord says, whom shall I send and who shall go for us? And the American military has been answering for a very long time, here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me. During his final State of the Union, our first State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. This was a sacred space to be having this speech. He used it a second time when he talked about our sacred obligation to take better care of our veterans. Now, I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral responsibility to take better care of those who fight wars on our behalf. But why would he bring in the word sacred? Why bring in aspects of the divine into this dialogue? Because Joe Biden believes that the U.S. Army is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. See, if you think Christian nationalism is a partisan problem, you're watching way too much CNN and MSNBC. They're not going to tell you this. Why? It would destroy their advertising revenue. Fox News doesn't have the theological acumen to understand what he's saying. They're not going to bring this up. So we have to be aware that Christian nationalism is a bipartisan problem. And if you ask me, Joe Biden is far stronger of a white Christian nationalism than Donald Trump is. And this should be terrifying for you. Why? Why is Christian nationalism such a bipartisan problem? Well, it goes back to this. The Doctrine of Discovery, written in 1452, between 1452 and 1493. The Doctrine of Discovery, it says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their lands are yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not believe they were human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of my book on Selling Truth says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview, and better yet, your church, tells you that the people living there are not fully human. You cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your car keys, your cell phones, your wallets out. I will be happy to come by and discover them for you. Right? This is not discovery. This is stealing. This is colonizing. The fact that we call it discovery reveals that the doctrine of discovery is a white, male supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine that's the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to empire. Now, I could spend another 45 minutes unpacking this statement I just gave you right here, but I don't have time to go into all of these things. So chapters 1 through 4 of my book goes into this, especially chapter 3 and 4 talks about how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like, love your neighbor and pray for those who persecute you, how it got from that to a doctrine that says you can kill people who don't look like, speak like, act like, eat like, or worship like you. It's a fascinating journey. I encourage you to read that. But we don't have time to go into all of that right now. So the challenge is this doctrine from the church gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he says to the colonists that are here in the 13 colonies that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upsets these colonists. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the founding fathers used these inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. Just look at the people in the room. It's all white men. Everyone else was not included. The Declaration of Independence is a systemically racist, sexist, that says men, not women, and white supremacist document. Now, a few years later, these very same men got together again, and they wrote another document. This one they began with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. Again, this sounds inclusive, right? We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. However, if you read, I don't want to go there yet. If we read a little bit further, down to Article 1, Section 2. Now, Article 1, Section 2 is a part of the Constitution that refers to who is and who is not covered by this document, who is and who is not a part of this nation. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you have to know is it never mentions women. And this is important because if you read the entire document, from the preamble down to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So back in 1787, who's left? Well, who's in the room? White men. And technically, you had to be a landowner in order to vote. You see, we don't think about this concretely enough. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect the interests of white landowning men. Now, I want to read just a few lines later in the preamble. We, the white landowning men of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, talking about the nation, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility for the nation, provide for the common defense for the nation, promote the general welfare for everybody, and secure the blessing and liberty for the nation? No. Who are they securing blessing and liberty for? For ourselves. And for who? For our posterity. Now, we need to define a few things here. First of all, what does liberty mean? Liberty is the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. Another way to say it is the power or scope to act as one pleases. This is what liberty means. Again, sometimes the shoe fits. Think about what would have happened if President Obama did a quarter of the things that Donald Trump has done in the past 12 years. What would have happened to President Obama had he done those things? See, the challenge is President Trump has found the loophole in the Constitution. He's found the loophole. The purpose of the Constitution is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves, to white landowning men, and to our posterity, to the posterity of white landowning men. Now, I had a conversation with AI about posterity, and I said, use posterity in a sentence for me. And it said the artists meticulously documented their techniques, hoping to preserve them for posterity. Protecting the environment is responsible for the sake of posterity. The judge reminded the defendants that their actions would be judged by posterity. They always just use posterity without anything before it. But in our Constitution, we say for our posterity. So I said, when would we use a phrase like our posterity? And it said you would use the phrase our posterity when emphasizing the actions or legacies intended to benefit or affect future generations, particularly those directly descended from or associated with the present group. We have to acknowledge, yes, the Constitution is about promoting the general welfare. Yes, it's about doing some trade and a few other things, but the goal regarding liberty in our Constitution is intended specifically, and I would argue solely, for the benefit of white landowning men. That's the purpose of our Constitution. That's why it exists. That's why the Democrats have no ability to hold Donald Trump to account right now, because they're out of the majority. Both parties know and understand that our judicial system is not about justice. They understand that. It's a weapon. Trump understood that when he pardoned his father-in-law after his first term. Trump understood that when he was sued and he was brought to court time and time again after his first term. He said this judicial system is a weapon. Joe Biden agreed when he left the office and he signed a preemptive pardon for his family and his staff, because he knows our judicial system is not about justice. Our judicial system is a weapon. And the purpose of this weapon is to secure the blessings of liberty for white landowning men and their children. And we proved in 1857 with the Dred Scott case, right? Where the Supreme Court agreed, yes, the purpose of the Constitution is not to protect formerly enslaved people. They're not protected by our documents. They're not protected by our foundations. The purpose of this document is to protect white men. In 1858, a politician running for office in the midterm elections was introducing himself to the nation. And he had to make a few things clear. And so in one of his early speeches of his political career, he said, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. But in so much as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race. So just to be clear, in September of 1858, a year after the Dred Scott decision, a candidate running for national office was publicly agreeing with the Dred Scott decision. Anyone know who this candidate was? It was Abraham Lincoln. Someone who is perceived by almost a unanimous amount of Americans to be our greatest president. Now, maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, you're a bit harsh on him. After all, he did the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Well, see, the thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is Abraham actually had it written. It was in his desk. He was afraid to release it because there were 4 states in the North that allowed slavery. And he didn't want to emancipate the slaves in those states for fear of losing the political support of those white slave owners. But the New York Tribune wrote a scathing op-ed demanding the immediate release of the slaves. And Abraham had already written those Emancipation Proclamation. It was in a desk, but he didn't want to release it. So instead, he wrote a letter. And in his letter, he clarified, he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. This statement is hanging in a museum at the Lincoln Memorial, declaring for everybody who enters that according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, Mr. Charles, that's a bit harsh. I mean, come on. He had a black friend, right? Yes, he may have had a black friend, but he took an oath to hold up a document whose primary purpose was not giving a crap about black people, but was securing the blessings of liberty for white landowning men and their posterity. And so even though Abraham Lincoln, when he ran for office, was opposed to the practice of chattel slavery, but absolutely believed in white supremacy, when he became president, he had a dilemma. Because he wanted to end slavery, not because he gave a crap about black people, but to hold his white supremacist union together. And this was causing a divide among them. And so he had everything on the table. He debated, what do we do? Do we send them back to Africa? Do we create a new continent, our new country for them? What do we do with these formerly enslaved people once we set them free? He already said, I have no intention of making voters or jurors of them or letting them hold office or intermarrying with us. I have no plan for them to ever be a part of our society. I absolutely agree with the Dred Scott decision. So what do we do? Well, you pass an amendment, right? And the problem is most of us think the amendment abolishes slavery. They think the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the country. That's not what it says. What it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted shall exist. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. We have never, it is 2025, and we have slavery 100% legal within our criminal justice system, protected twice now by the Constitution. First is protected in the preamble, where we make it very clear this Constitution is about protecting white men. And then we have the 13th Amendment that says, and by the way, slavery is still legal in our prison system. And this is the prison system that has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world and incarcerates people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate it incarcerates white people. True to the founding documents of this country, Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. But I want to go back to the Doctrine of Discovery, because it's not just a legal doctrine. It's a theological doctrine. In 1630, John Winthrop was on board a ship. It was in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was with a group of colonists. They were here to plant the Boston colony. And on board that ship, he preached a sermon one Sunday titled A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the colonists he was with as a city upon a hill. Now he's borrowing from the language of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all patience, gentleness, meekness, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Christian exhortation. At the end of his sermon, he does what a lot of Christian Protestant pastors do, which is he compels his congregants to obedience by threatening them with the Old Testament. And he chose to use Deuteronomy 30 as his threat. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage of the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of his land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things to you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. End of this passage, it says, but if our hearts will turn away so that we will not obey, and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop actually changes those words to vast sea. Now, why does he do that? Well, because they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed a vast sea. They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the model of Old Testament Israel, based on the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, they are standing on the shores of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. Has anyone ever read the rest of the scriptures of Deuteronomy about how Israel is supposed to take possession of their promised lands? In Deuteronomy, it's pretty clear. The people of Israel are told, as they go into Canaan, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. You see, promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another group of people. I call this sermon the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. That idea percolates. This is the 1630s for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, a Supreme Court case comes up. It's Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two white men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got their land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the US government, and they want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the John Marshall Court. They had to determine what was the legal precedent for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? They rule that it is discovery that gives title to the government, by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. Then, because that might actually possibly imply that natives had rights to their lands, John Marshall goes even further, and he says, clarifying, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. So now we have discovery and the doctrine of discovery being established as the legal precedent for land titles. Mid-1800s, late 1800s, our country continues spanning westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, we go past the Mississippi River. Or mid-1700s, sorry. Early 1800s. By 1845, early 1800s, the Second Great Awakening is happening. There's this growth in churches, a renewal within denominations. Early 1800s, 1845, the term manifest destiny is coined. The belief that this nation of white landowning men has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. Now, I would love to go deep into the genocidal history that followed. And I don't have time to go that far into this because I want to get to some other points on this. But it's horrible. And at the center of that is actually Abraham Lincoln, this blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. As we look at his Indian policies, after signing the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, he goes on to remove the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota. He goes on to remove the Shoshone from their lands in southern Utah, in northern Utah, and southern Idaho. He goes on to remove the Navajo, my people, from the Southwest. And he ends up with the massacre at Sand Creek of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in eastern Colorado. 8 days after that last massacre, Abraham Lincoln's giving his his annual address. And in his address, he says that 1.6 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. He was very confident 8 days after that fourth massacre that we were going to complete manifest destiny. What made him so confident? How was he so certain we were going to do this? Well, when you put those massacres on this map of the early lines of the Transcontinental Railway, you see there's a central route that goes through the central part of the country. It had made it to Omaha, Nebraska, had to go through Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and come out in California around San Francisco. There was a northern route starting at Duluth, Minnesota, going through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and coming out near Seattle. And then there's a southern route going through the territory of New Mexico and Arizona and coming out near Los Angeles, California. After we have the removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, the removal of the Shoshone with the Bear River Massacre in northern Utah and southern Idaho, after the long walk of the Navajo from the Southwest, and the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln has essentially ethnically cleansed the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway, making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And this is exactly what Promised Land theology teaches, right? In Joshua, it says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Now, lest you think it was only Abraham Lincoln who did these things, that's not true. If we look at the population growth from 1500 to 1900, you can see in the 1500s, the world population was 480 million. 1900 was 1.6 billion. That's a 3.39% rate of growth. Europe went from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65 rate of growth. Africa, even with the horrors of the slave trade, went from 63 million to 123 million. That's a 1.782 rate of growth. North America went from zero, right? We were savages. There were no humans here. We went to 76.2 million in 1900. That's not even calculable. And Turtle Island, right? A very conservative estimate of natives inhabiting continental United States in 1500 is 6 million. That's a very conservative estimate. The low was in 1870 with 237,000. That's a 0.0395 rate of growth, or rate of death, a rate of genocide of 96.05%. And we knew what we were doing, right? In 1851, Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, giving his State of the State address, he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't feed them, nor is he saying hunger has hit and we can't feed them. He's literally saying we can't stop killing them until we complete our manifest destiny. Now you're thinking, Mr. Charles, this was a long time ago. We don't think that way anymore. Well, I want you to think back just a few years ago, 2015. Benjamin Netanyahu was in the United States. He was protesting the agreement that the Obama administration was negotiating with Iran over their nuclear facilities. And he came and gave a speech to a joint session of our Congress. And in his speech, he hit on one of the most unifying themes in American politics, which is the theme of American exceptionalism. And he told our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. You see, the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship. Has nothing to do with freedom or equality. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify what we did to African Americans and Native Americans. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they are doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We are not the voice of reason in this conflict. We are in a dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's all about justifying ethnic cleansing, violence, and even genocide. And we don't know what to do with that. And you're thinking about Mr. Charles, just yesterday, 24 Democrats voted against sending weapons to Israel. I love how we get excited about how we're just barely beginning to possibly learn that other people might actually have value as humans. And we get so excited. Look at, out of 100 people, 24 of us said we should kill them. That's nothing to celebrate. Why? Because we're still sending the weapons. We're still doing it. The challenge we face as a nation is that we have a horrific history built on the lie of white supremacy, built on a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, and it's not a partisan problem. If it was a partisan problem, we could handle that. We could just vote that party out of office. The problem is this is a foundational problem. This is something written into our Constitution. This is something written into our minds and in our psyche. It's part of the air that we breathe. It's the way we think about who we are and what we do and what we're about. This is a foundational level problem. I would tell people, if you think the Declaration or the Constitution of the United States was meant to give equality to everybody, get into a diverse group of people and read the document out loud. You will be embarrassed and shocked at how quickly our document, our Constitution, turns racist, sexist, and blatantly white supremacist. And we as a nation don't know what to do with that. There's an elder named George Erasmus. He lives in Canada. When he was writing about the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission that was going to take place there several years ago, he used to quote, it's one of my favorite quotes. His quote says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. I love that quote because I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of segregation, mass incarceration, internment camps, families being ripped apart at our borders. And there's no common memory. And if we're honest, there is no point that we can look back in US history and say, oh, yes, remember back then when we had such good community across racial and gender lines. That point does not exist. We have never in our history have had healthy community. This is why the term racial reconciliation is a misnomer. Reconciliation implies we're restoring a previous harmony. That is not true. Race is a human construct. There is no genetic definition of race. Race is a human construct, and we constructed it specifically for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. Racial reconciliation is a misnomer. We need racial conciliation. And the only way we're going to get that is by beginning to build a common memory. We have to talk about what we've done, what we've been built on. We have to allow the history to be told from the margins. The challenge is that the victors write the history. And the U.S. has never lost a war that matters. We have won. And by we, I'm going to say white landowning men on the backs of people from the margins have won every war we fought in. Technically, the Korean War is not over yet. We pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We lost some pride, but didn't lose any land. We've won every major conflict we've been a part of. As a result, white landowning men have been able to write their own history for 250, almost 300 years. This is why we need to hear the history from the margins. We need to create this common memory if we're going to have any hope of building a healthier community moving forward. Not rebuilding it, not reconciling it, building it for the very first time. This is one of the reasons I'm doing the work I'm doing right now, because I am going on a common memory tour, bringing this history as far as I can. I have two more points I want to make. I talked about Christian nationalism. I want to talk about creation stories. My Navajo grandparents on my father's side are boarding school survivors. Like many boarding school survivors, they were taken from their homes. They were put into military-style boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their language. They were punished for practicing their culture. I've sat with boarding school survivors before. The stories I've heard of abuse, physical, emotional, mental, sexual, that happened in those boarding schools is gut-wrenching. My grandparents never spoke to me much about their boarding school experience, but I know it scarred them. And I saw it in their faith. The faith they were given in their boarding school was Jesus loves you when you talk English and you cut your hair and you wear a suit and you learn English and you sing songs in the white culture. Jesus loves you if you're white. Because of that spiritual legacy, my grandparents didn't teach the language to my father, and so my father didn't know to teach the language to me. They didn't give the ceremonies to my father, and so my father didn't know the ceremonies to give them to me. On my mom's side of the family, they were from the Netherlands, part of the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church has had a mission presence in the U.S. or in the Southwest for over 100 years. When Abraham Lincoln went through and ethnically cleansed the Navajo people from the Southwest, he did that so they could build the railroad that goes through Gallup, New Mexico. Just a mile, not even a mile, half a mile off of that railroad is the mission compound of the Christian Reformed Church. It used to be a boarding school, and it's named Rehoboth. And it says, the Lord has given us room, and we shall flourish in the land. The Lord didn't give them that room. Their nation ethnically cleansed it for them. Kicked the Navajo off, brought us down to a death camp in Bosque Redondo. And when they brought us back, they made us sign a treaty telling the country that we would not oppose their building of a railroad through our lands. And then the Christian Reformed Church set up a boarding school on that land. So my father's parents were told, if you want to be loved by God, you have to be white. And my mother's church was running the frickin' boarding school. So yeah, that's my spiritual legacy. That's what I grew up with. And I didn't see it as a problem. About 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I moved with my family. I was pastoring a church in Denver, Colorado. And we moved. We were part of a group of indigenous Christians all around the world who was meeting regularly called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. I was meeting indigenous leaders from all over the globe, meeting on a regular basis with them. And I realized if I wanted to really lead within my identity, I had to move back to the Navajo Nation. I'd grown up in a border town. I didn't know my language. I didn't know my people. I've never lived on our lands. So I went back and we moved into the most remote section of our reservation we could find. We moved 6 miles off the nearest paved road onto a dirt road. We lived in a one-room hogan, 20 feet in diameter, had dirt floor, log walls. The community we lived in had no running water, no electricity. We had an outhouse about 75 yards away. We had to haul our water, cooked by a camp stove or over an open fire. We had cows and sheep, as our closest neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. And it was there. Looking back, I did one of the most rebellious things I've ever done as a Christian. The most rebellious thing I've ever done. See, there's a tradition in the Navajo culture. Is you wake up early in the morning and you go to the east and you greet the sunrise with your prayers. And when I moved back to the reservation, I decided I was going to lean into that tradition. And I started waking up every morning, walking on my hogan, going towards the east, and greeting the sunrise with my prayer. Now, when you see the sunrise on an Easter morning, it's always beautiful. If you have an early flight, it can take your breath away occasionally. But something happens when you go out in a stance of prayer and you watch the sunrise day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade. It does something really, really deep to you. Something I'm still continuing to unpack. Watching the sunrise regularly for 25 years is by far the most disruptive, life-giving, transforming spiritual discipline I have ever had. After I ran for president, I was spent. I was certain at some point my campaign would catch on. I mean, who doesn't want to live in a nation where we the people might actually mean all the people? Who doesn't want to live in a nation that removes the racist, sexist, and white supremacist language from our foundations? Who doesn't want to live in a nation who's actually abolished slavery completely? I was so convinced that at some point our campaign was going to catch on and we were going to at least have an impact on the dialogue in that election. But it never happened. I wasn't running because I felt like God had told me to go be president. I wasn't running with any kind of promise of that I was going to become the president of the United States. I thought I was running for some reasons that were close to the values I saw God had in the scriptures. Values for loving people and caring for the poor and the least and helping those who are in need. And so when the nation told me very clearly, no, we don't want to talk about these things, Mark. We don't want to have this conversation. We don't want to go there. I was spent. And COVID was going on. We weren't going anywhere. And so every morning, since we had moved to DC 7 years earlier, 6 years earlier, I realized I hadn't been watching the sunrise near as much because I didn't know where to go in this concrete jungle to find the sunrise. And so I started driving around and I found a place on the Potomac. And I would go there every morning and watch the sunrise. And I would watch the sunrise and I would pray and I would thank God and I would renew my life for a new day of watching another opportunity to know God and to walk in beauty and to know my neighbors and to know my relatives and to walk with Creator. And it was a beautiful, beautiful moment every time I sat there and watched the sunrise. And I would just praise God from the depths of my soul. And then 5 minutes later, I'd be walking down the path, praying, and I would be screaming at God. And I could not figure out why. Like, what's wrong with me? How can I love and praise God so deeply here, and then 5 minutes later be screaming at God? And I realized after analyzing this for several weeks, maybe even a few months, that I was praising, I was praying to, I was thanking Creator, and I was screaming at the God of Abraham. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time in Israel. I've even been discipled by a Messianic Jewish believer who lives in Israel. He came to my reservation, I mentored him, and I went to his, and he mentored me. I learned a lot through him. And I am fairly confident that the Jewish community would see Creator and the God of Abraham and the God of Israel as one and the same being. They wouldn't make a distinction between those. All be all what Christians call the Father, right, or the Yahweh. This is what they would see that as all the same. But I realized I couldn't relate that way to the God of Abraham. Why? Because if I'm honest, the God of Abraham would have killed me, as well as most of you. Right? There's a book about the Doctrine of Discovery by Stephen Newcomb called Pagans in the Promised Land. Why? Because what happens when the God's people have promised lands? What happens to the people living in those promised lands? They get killed. They get genocided. And I realized I didn't know how to relate to Creator or to the God of Abraham. And for the first time, I felt like because I felt so comfortable and safe with Creator that I could actually say to myself, I don't know if I believe in the Trinity anymore. Because when I relate to God, I don't see a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. I see Creator. I see the God of Abraham. I see Jesus. And I see the Spirit. I know how to relate to Creator. I know how to relate to the Spirit. To be honest, I have a whole lot of issues with Jesus, and we can talk about those later. But the God of Abraham would have killed me. So I don't know how to relate to that God. And my confidence with Creator gave me the courage to say that. And so I started thinking more about this. And I started thinking, I wonder how my grandparents might have heard these missionary stories about Creator, because Christians aren't just evangelistic about Jesus. They're evangelistic with their entire Bible, right? You don't just have to know Jesus. You have to give up your creation story and take their creation story. You have to give up your understanding of God and take their understanding of God. It's very one-directional. And so I imagine my grandparents, right? Because I would imagine they had grown up doing what I'd been doing for the past 20 years, which is watching the sunrise every morning and building this deep, intimate relationship with Creator. And then being told by these missionaries that, well, you actually don't know Creator. That's a false Creator. There's a different Creator, and you can read about him in our book. And so they were telling them about this book and this Creator in this book. And so, again, there's a creation story. And so, okay, we know the creation story. Most Christians don't know their book has two creation stories, not just one. There's actually two. God creates man and woman in different orders and creates the creation in different orders. And it's because the creation stories is not a textbook. It's not a science textbook. It's about how to relate to God and how to relate to Creator. And the two stories in Genesis 1 and 2 give you different ways of relating to Creator through those stories. And so right? So we have the creation story, we have Adam and Eve, and again, I wish I could go through all of this for you. I don't have time to go through all of this. But what I began looking at as I looked at the stories of Creator, because you have Creator, and then Creator becomes known as the God of Abraham. And the God of Abraham is pretty jealous. And he tests Abraham by asking him to do what? Kill his son, right? The God of Abraham looks at the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and decides to do what with the people there? Kill them all. He says he'll save it if there's 10 righteous people in the city. He sends his angels in. Lot takes them into their house. The men of the city go to Lot's house and say, hey, we see those men in there. Let them out. We want to have our way with them. Lot says, no, don't do that. That's evil. But he doesn't stop there, right? What does he say? Here, take my daughters. They're virgins. Have fun with them. Lot pimps out his daughters. The next day, God decides to destroy the city because clearly Lot's not righteous. He tells him, don't turn around. As they're running away, Lot's wife turns around and immediately she gets turned into a pillar of salt. So the God of Abraham is more concerned about a woman who turns around than a man who pimps out his daughters. That's deeply troubling. The God of Abraham later becomes known as the God of Israel. The God of Israel kills the firstborn of every child in Egypt. When he's up on the mountain with Moses, giving them the 10 Commandments, the people start worshiping a golden calf. And God says, here, go away, Moses. My people are worshiping another God. I'm going to destroy them. Moses pleads for the life of the people, but he doesn't appeal to God's character as creator. He doesn't say, you made these people, they're in your image. How can you possibly destroy them? He doesn't appeal to that. What does he appeal to? His ego, right? The world saw you bring your people out with a mighty hand. If you destroy them in the desert, they'll think it was with evil intent that you did this. And the God of Israel repented and did not bring on the destruction he had intended. The God of Israel was persuaded based on an appeal to his ego to not destroy his people. That's deeply troubling. Finally, they get to Canaan. Now the God of Israel says, now I want you to do the killing. Go in, leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Kill everybody that's in there. In 1 Samuel, the people of Israel go to Samuel and they say, we want a king like everybody else. And Samuel laments and goes to God and says, they're rejecting me as their prophet. They want a king. And God corrects him and he says, they're not rejecting you as their prophet. They're rejecting me as their king. So throughout the scriptures, you have God identifying as creator, and then as the God of Abraham, the God of a man, and then as God of Israel, the God of a nation, and eventually as king. God calls God's self king in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And the further the character of God gets from creator and the closer the character of God gets to king, the more violent, the more destructive, the more vindictive, the more nationalistic, and the more abusive that God becomes. That is deeply, deeply troubling. And yet we're the ones being told, you have a pagan, evil view of God. The gods you know from watching the sunrise and sitting in creation is false. The God we know by reading a book is true. Let's think about this for a moment. where would be the best place to learn about Creator? Any ideas? In creation makes a bit more sense to me, right? Not that the book can be wrong, but if you're going to have a foundation for how you know and relate to Creator, you should probably know and relate to Creator through creation, and then maybe jot a few thoughts down in the book. But when you allow your understanding of God to be defined by a book, and then you maybe might experience one or two things through creation, that's a bit more of a troubling pattern. And the problem here is that white Europeans are some of the people most furthest removed from any sense of being indigenous and any sense of having their own creation story. And so they've literally co-opted the creation story of the Jewish people in the Bible, which the Jewish people co-opted from the people of Mesopotamia. And then they point to that creation story and say, this is who God is and this is the way God works. And everyone else is wrong, and you have to give up what you learned through creation, and you have to study Latin and Hebrew and learn what we wrote down in this book. And they're the people who know the least and have the least experience with relating to God through their own lands and through their own creation stories. And so the challenge we have with the creation stories is not that the Bible's wrong, necessarily, but that it disregards so many other valuable and tried and tested ways of understanding and knowing God. And it says, yeah, everyone else has it wrong. We're the ones who have it right. And you have to give up everything that you have and embrace what's written in our book. And so the whole challenge with the creation story understanding is, I'm actually writing a second book right now. It's called Decolonizing Faith. And the reason I'm writing this book is the purpose of this book is I want to cause a crisis of faith in the church. That's my purpose for writing this book. I want to cause a crisis of faith in the church. Why? Because so many Christians, when they hear me talk about the doctrine of discovery, you know what they say to me? Mr. Charles, the church and Christians have done horrible things to your people. How can you be a Christian? Now, that's a valid question. And it requires a lot of deep thinking and processing and even some crisis on my part to come to an understanding of that. But I have to turn the tables and say to you, now that I've told you what your church has done and what it's done to people, not just in my community, but throughout the globe, how can you be a Christian? How can you be a Christian? Let me put it a little more succinctly. How can you leave your homes and your churches in the cities of the United States and go to reservations where people are impoverished and do not even have control of their own lands. And how can you go to them knowing that you have a house that the title to that house is based on a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery? And how can you go to this reservation thinking you're representing the love of God? How can you do that? You can't. You can't do it. But this is what churches do. Week after week, month after month, year after year, summer after summer, wave after wave of churches come to our reservations to share with us the love of God and then return to their homes and the churches whose titles of those lands are literally based on a doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was last used as the legal precedent for land titles in a Supreme Court case in 2005. One of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, and it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I have a TEDx talk on it. You can go watch that, called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. So what I want to challenge you with, my relatives, is I want to challenge you to think deeply and critically about your faith and about your doctrines. And then to think about, what does it mean for you to have integrity when you go poor and go to the marginalized and go to the least, to share with them the love of God, when so much of what you have is based on the exploitation of the very people that you're going to serve. I want to challenge you and put you into a crisis of faith, not because I want to have bad things happen to you, or I think ill of you, but because this will make you a much more compassionate and empathetic and humble person. And speaking as the grandson of boarding school survivors, that's my goal. And I want to invite you into this disruptive journey by doing something very similar to what I did, which is waking up day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and watching the sunrise. It will teach you at a very deep level that you are not in control. And it will show you some amazing things about Creator that I can tell you, as someone who was raised as a white evangelical, I never saw before. One of the most amazing things I learned during this period was that no matter what happened in the previous 24 hours, no matter what I did, no matter what my church did, no matter what my nation did, no matter what the globe did, it didn't matter what happened in the previous 24 hours, every single morning, the sun rose. Every single morning, the sun rose. Every single morning, I had another opportunity to know God, to know Creator, to walk in beauty with my neighbors, and to understand the people living around me. Every single morning. And that confidence in Creator is what's given me the ability to ask the questions that I'm asking today. And I've never felt more at peace with God than I felt in the past 4 or 5 years as I've really leaned into this. If you would have told me 5 years ago the question I'd be asking today, I would say, really, when did I lose my faith and become a heretic? But to be honest, I don't feel like a heretic at all. I feel like I am someone who knows God and wants to know God better. And I've never felt more in touch with Creator than I felt over the past 5 or 6 years of my life. And I want to invite you into that same thing. I have a few minutes left. I'm actually way over, but I want to talk to you briefly about corn. A little over 2 years ago, I did something because I was not healthy. I had my hip replaced, and I had my hip replaced, and it really scared me because I was not healthy. By my BMI, I was technically obese. My blood sugar was high. I was in the pre-diabetic stage. I was developing sleep apnea. I was not eating healthy. I was fairly sedentary. I wasn't moving well. And I didn't even know it. What clued me in was it was during COVID. My daughters wanted to learn how to play basketball, and I couldn't run with them because my hip was not working. And when I got my hip replaced, I told my doctor, I told my physical therapist, I told my nurses, I said, I am never going to take my health for granted again. I said, I'm going to get back in shape, I'm going to get healthy, and I'm never going to take my health for granted again because I don't want to miss another opportunity with my daughters. Now, anyone here ever try to get healthy? It's not easy, right? There's a ton of books out there. And every author has their one thing. I found the one thing. Eat this. Don't eat this. Move this way. Don't move that way. Go to bed at this time. Don't go to bed at that time. Eat at these hours. Don't eat at those. Everyone has their one thing, right? And if you do their one thing, you will be beautiful, you'll be prosperous, and you'll live to be 120. The problem is they're not all wrong, but they're also not all right. And if you're going to glean anything from these, you have to find some way to filter what you're being told and what's gibberish and garbage and needs to be disposed of and what is good and do you need to keep. And so I went through, over the past 2 years, I have read so many books. I have tried so many things. I've lost nearly 60 pounds. I've changed nearly every measure of my health, from my eating to my movement to my steps to my breathing to my circadian rhythm. I've changed every measure of my health. I am the healthiest I have ever been in my life right now. And as I was reading through all these books and researching these things, I realized the filter I was going back to more and more frequently was the filter of indigenous wisdom. How did my people live prior to colonization? What did we eat? How do we move? How do we breathe? How do we live prior to colonization? And it blew my mind, the things that we knew. I want to give you one example, corn. Corn is an amazing food. Europeans didn't know it. We cultivated it here in the Americas long before Columbus got lost at sea. We've been eating a corn-based diet for hundreds of years. corn is, if you look at it evolutionary, corn is one of the most successful evolutionary stories in the history of the world. It threw its lot entirely in with humans, and it succeeded beyond its wildest dreams, right? Corn, if you threw a husk of corn on the ground, it wouldn't grow. The corn couldn't get through the husk, and even if it did, they're so closely packed together, they would starve each other out. Corn is dependent upon people with opposable thumbs plucking the corn out and planting them individually. It's entirely dependent upon us. And it's thrived, not only in the Americas, where we've been eating a corn-based diet as Native peoples for hundreds of years, but now it's all around the globe, and it's the basis for most of our foods and a lot of our economy. Most Native peoples, again, we cultivated corn first. We've been eating it for hundreds of years, and for most Native peoples, corn is sacred. It's a part of our creation story. It's something seen as very, very powerful, but also incredibly life-giving, but also very, very dangerous. And when we met Europeans, we told them about corn. And I'm sure we told them about what we call the three sisters, because we learned that when you grow corn, you grow it together with beans and with squash. The corn grows up, it provides a trellis for the beans, which provides nitrogen for the dirt, which keeps it fertile. The squash grows and keeps a covering over the ground, which keeps the moisture in the ground. And you grow the three sisters together like that on a rotating field basis, so you don't you don't eat up all the nutrients in the ground. Europeans came, they saw our corn, we taught them how to grow it, what it was, and they went crazy with it. They started single field planting it. They would plant it year after year in the same field. And then it would, they would just clear new fields and plant more of it. And soon, just like us, they were eating a corn-based diet. Now, the problem with corn is it's an incomplete nutrient. And when you eat a corn-based diet, there's a vitamin or a micronutrient you're not getting, which is called niacin. Now, if you don't get enough niacin, you get a disease called pellagra. Just like if you don't eat enough vitamin C, you get what's called scurvy. And you need to eat vitamin C to cure your scurvy. And if you don't, it will kill you. The same thing is with pellagra. And so here in the United States and in Italy, there were pellagra epidemics in the early 1900s. We didn't know what micronutrients were, but every spring there would be epidemics of pellagra with tens of thousands of people dying every year in both here and in Italy. In the United States, we cured our pellagra problem in a moment. 1 year we fixed it. Do you know what we did? We added niacin to our flour and our rice and our pasta. Micronutrients. Italy fixed theirs over 10 years. They told their citizens to bake bread communally, to drink more wine, which was made with yeast, which has niacin in it, and to raise rabbits, which is a cheap form of meat, which also has niacin in it. And in 10 years, they got rid of their pellagra problem. But we cured ours overnight by fixing our food, modifying our food. So 10,000 people a year were dying from pellagra, and we changed the nutrient content of food for everybody. Fast forward 120 years, we have an obesity epidemic of over 44%. And Italy has an obesity rate of about 12%. You see, we changed our food. And while that solved one problem, it created a myriad of other problems. In the 1940s, the University of Minnesota did a test to see how could they get a pig to butchering weight the fastest. Do you know how you do it? You force it to live a sedentary lifestyle. You put it in a cage where it can't move. You feed a corn-based diet fortified with micronutrients and vitamins. And you will get it to a butchering weight almost twice as fast as if you just let it graze on the pasture. And this is exactly what we're doing to us. Our sedentary lifestyles, our corn-based diets, and I'm not talking just corn on the cob. Corn is in almost all of our processed foods, from high fructose corn syrups to starches and things we put out. It's in so many, I think it's in half of our foods in the grocery store. We eat corn on a daily basis. It's a commodity. Farmers can't even make money growing corn. The only reason they grow corn is because they get a government funding for growing it, which doesn't help them. It helps the producers that make the high fructose corn syrup and all these other things. Now, corn has niacin in it, but it's not accessible to the body. To make the niacin accessible to the body in corn, you have to put it through a process called nixtamalization. You have to cook it with something acidic. Corn was first cultivated in the southern Americas, where the people there for centuries have been cooking their corn with lime. In the tamales and in the other things they make, the tortillas, they've been cooking it with lime. My people, the Navajo people, we have been eating a corn-based diet for a long time, hundreds of years. We make something called blue corn mush. In the recipe for blue corn mush, you take the blue corn, the ground corn, water, and you cook it with juniper ash. Juniper ash provides the acidity to cause the nixtamalization, which makes the niacin in corn accessible to your body so you don't get sick and die from flagra. Now, we didn't know what the micronutrients were, but we knew how to eat corn so it wouldn't kill you. The problem is when these Europeans came with their doctrine of discovery, which told them they were superior and we were inferior, they were God's chosen people and we were the pagans in their promised lands, they thought we had nothing to teach them. There was nothing of value we could give them. And so they never bothered to ask us, how do you live well within these lands? And it's not just corn. I want to read a few short stories for you here. There was a contemporary of Lewis and Clark named George Catlin, who was an artist. He traveled throughout the Midwest into the plains, met with native nations from all over the world, or all over the Americas. I want to read what was written about him in a book called Breath by James Nestor. He went up to the Missouri to live with the Lakota Sioux. He met with the Pawnee, Omaha, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet along the banks of the upper Missouri. He happened upon the civilization of the Mandan, a mysterious tribe whose members stood 6 feet tall and lived in bubble-shaped houses. Many had luminous blue eyes and snow-white hair. Catlin realized that nobody knew much about the Mandan or other Plains tribes because no one of European descent had ever bothered to spend time talking with them, researching them, living with them, or learning about their beliefs and traditions. I am traveling this country, he said before, not to advance or to prove theories, but to see all I'm able to see and to tell it in the simplest and most intelligible manner I can to the world for their own conclusions, Catlin wrote. He would paint some 600 portraits and take hundreds of pages of notes, forming what famed artist Peter Matheson would call the first, last, and only complete record ever made of the Plains Indians at the height of their splendid culture. As he traveled throughout our lands, he noticed that Native peoples all over the country were taller than Europeans, were stronger than Europeans, were healthier than Europeans, had perfectly straight teeth, and were adamant about breathing through our noses. You see, most Europeans were already back then breathing through their mouths. The reason they were breathing through their mouths is because they were eating more and more processed foods. And the less you chew, because the softer your food is, the smaller your mouth gets. The smaller your mouth gets, the smaller your nasal cavities get. The smaller your nasal cavities get, the more you have to breathe through your mouth than through your nose to get air into your lungs. When you breathe through your mouth, the air goes directly into your lungs, unfiltered and uncooled, or unwarmed. When you breathe through your nose, it gets filtered through your mucous membranes. It gets heated up, and it's 98.6 degrees when it hits your lungs. Much cleaner. Europeans, because they were eating these soft foods, were breathing through their noses. He noticed that native tribes would mothers would stand over their babies and watch them after they were born. And when they started breathing through their mouths, they would close them. He said some tribes put their babies on boards with a small back to it. And the small back would make them put their head a bit forward, and they couldn't put their head back when they slept and open their mouths to breathe, forcing them to breathe through their noses. My people slept on cradle boards, training us how to breathe through our noses. I want to read one other story for you here. This is by Ernest Houghton, the 1930s anthropologist. Since we have known for a long time that savages have excellent teeth and that civilized men have terrible teeth, it seems to me that we have been extraordinarily stupid in concentrating all of our attention upon the task of finding out why our teeth are so poor without ever bothering to learn why the savage's teeth are so good. You see, this is the challenge. When you have a doctrine of discovery that tells you you're human, the rest are savages, you're God's chosen, the rest are God's curse, you have everything to offer, they have nothing to give. When you come into their land, you never bother to ask. And because of that, our country, not only is it destroying the environment that we're living in, but it's destroying our health. And we're dying of diseases that did not exist in the indigenous population prior to colonization. And they never bothered to ask. There's one of my favorite authors. Her name is Katie Bowman. She's a biomechanist. She talks about how she talks about the difference between, well, in this book, she's writing about what she calls the reductionary use of science. So if you want to be a doctor, you study biology. And then you study human anatomy. And then you study the respiratory system. And then you study the lung. And then you study the left ventricle of the lung. And then you become the expert on the small little corner of the left ventricle of the lung. And that's your expertise. And that's a great way to study the body and get to know how it works. But she said that's not how movement works. And in her statement, she says here, she says, I would suggest that we've been this sedentary and survived. We have no idea how to move, and so we are turning to science to show us. P.S. That's not science's role at all, but when you have an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere, and scientific data is where many of us are turning. I love that idea where she says, when you have an elder-free society. When you come here and think you are the first people on these lands, you discovered these lands. No one else here before you was human, therefore they have nothing to offer you. You will begin using even the things you do know, science, in ways that was not intended, and that will actually be detrimental to you. When I lived on the Navajo Nation and we moved there, I'm going to end with this. When we moved there from Denver, we prepared to live off the grid. We prepared to haul our water and live by candlelight and use an outhouse and live with sheep and goats and cows. But what we weren't prepared for was how isolated we were. And when we moved there, we realized very quickly that it felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. At the same time, I was wrestling with the history I was learning about the doctrine of discovery and what I was learning about the church and how we were being treated and how we were being marginalized. And I was trying to make sense of how I felt about this. And every time I brought it to my friends, I would feel myself getting more and more angry. And I didn't know how to talk to them about it. I'd just hang up the phone. So I started talking about it like in the third person, like I read it in the newspaper. This let me stay in the conversation longer, but the longer I stayed in the conversation, the more my friends got defensive. Well, we didn't do that to you. That wasn't my family or my church. We didn't cause those problems. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I didn't know how to have a conversation about it. And finally, one afternoon, I was writing a letter for like the 10th time trying to tell my friends how it felt to be Native American, living on this country in the middle of our country, but on a reservation. And I said, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that causes us the most pain, the thing that hurts us the most, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, Mr. Charles, that's way too simple. All this damage, all this history, all these stories, how can saying thank you possibly be a fix? Well, I think the way this works is the challenge we're facing as a nation is not necessarily a challenge that is going to be solved by identifying the victim versus oppressor. Because that still leaves you with a lot of power. The challenge is we have a reversal of roles, which we have hundreds of millions of undocumented immigrants in this country, most of them from Europe. They've never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. And they're running around acting like they own the place. Meanwhile, we have Native peoples who've been pushed aside to the margins of society, and we're being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. What I need, what I want, what I'm advocating for is I want the majority culture to understand in some very real and practical ways you are guests in someone's house. And what I want my Native people to understand that in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land. And you need to act into your role as guests, and we need to step into our role as the host. And when you go to the people whose land you acknowledge you are on, and you say, thank you for allowing us to be on this land, that gives them an opportunity to stand up as the grandmother in the bedroom and say, it's about time. Now, let me tell you how to fix that toilet that's been leaking. Let me tell you how to quiet the dog that's been barking. Let me tell you to fix that thing that's been creaking. Let me show you what it means to live here well. This is not a promise, but it's a hope. And it's a hope because I think this is what you are searching for. When Trump is running around renaming the Gulf of America, renaming Mount Denali back to Mount McKinley, what's he doing? Wanting his name on Mount Rushmore. What's he doing? He's trying to legitimize white people's presence in these lands. Your creation story doesn't take place here. You don't even have a creation story. The creation story you co-opt from the Jewish people doesn't take place here. It doesn't give you legitimacy in these lands. You want legitimacy in these lands, you need to make relationships and treaties with the people whose land you're living on. The U.S. came in and they took the Mount Rushmore hills. They took the hills from the Dakota people and they carved the faces of their most genocidal presidents into them. Later, they felt bad about it and they went back to the Dakota and said, perhaps we could pay you for those mountains. And the Lakota people said, no, they're not for sale. There is literally $1 billion sitting in a trust fund that Dakota refused to touch because they will not let this country pay for their hill. The Black Hills are not for sale. You can give them back, but you cannot buy them from us. During President Obama's last year in office, he went up to Alaska and renamed Mount McKinley back to Denali. A white evangelical publication contacted me and said, Mark, we would love for you to write an article about how significant this renaming is for Native people. I said, sure, I'll write an article for you. But the article I gave them was not why this was significant for Native people. I said, this is why this is significant for white people. I said years ago, a prospector came out of these mountains, Mount Denali, something the Athabascan people have been calling them for hundreds, even thousands of years. It's in their creation story. And he heard when he came out of the mountains that McKinley had been nominated for president. And in celebration, he named the mountain he just came out of McKinley, and the name stuck. The Athabascan began working ever since then to rename the mountains back to Denali. They easily could have said, these white people don't know anything. They're not from these lands. They don't know these lands. They don't know these stories. In their ignorance, they can call the lands whatever they want. We know the significance. We will call it Denali amongst ourselves. But they didn't. They said, no, we want you. We invite you. We ask you to call this mountain by its right name. We give you permission to refer to our sacred mountain as Denali. I said, what an amazing gift the Athabascan people are trying to give this colonial nation that has no understanding of the value of the land they're on by inviting them, by asking them to use the proper name for their mountain. This is an amazing gift that the Athabascan people are giving to these colonizers. And then earlier this year, Trump went back and said, no, we don't want it. We'd rather name it after a white guy who never visited it. Why? Because he wants something that legitimizes white people's presence here. And that legitimacy is only going to come through relationship. And at some point, that relationship is going to require reparation and apology, but we're not even close to that point yet. So maybe, possibly, that relationship could start by the people who took over the house and threw the party and locked the grandmother upstairs in the bedroom by going upstairs and saying, "Thank you for not kicking us out of your house." And maybe that could be a starting point for a conciliation process of, for the very first time, building a healthy relationship. One that might actually, potentially, maybe, possibly lead to many of you having a legitimate space here in these lands. As my people would say, Pojono Haslin, Pojono Haslin, Pojono Haslin, Pojono Haslin. Walk in beauty, my relatives. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together.
Do you want the questions up front? Or do you want to do them back and just somebody wants to talk to you? What would you rather do?
Well, people need to go, they can go. If they want to stay in this I'm happy to stay.
All right. Well, thank you again, Mark. Honored to have you here in Shoreline. So folks, what we're going to do now is, for those of you that want to go, that's fine. Mark has graciously said that he is happy to answer some questions for you. So if you would like to stick around and you do have some questions for Mark, we're going to do that in just a moment. So there's going to be a couple of us just going around with mics. So if you have a question, some of you may have written them out already on cards, or some of you, just as he was speaking, had some questions that you had come to mind. So in just a second, we're going to do that. I'm going to be walking around, and then somebody else is going to be walking around on this side. Okay. In just a moment, Jessica's going to say something here, and then we'll go ahead and question. So you're welcome, free to leave, but also free to stay and talk with Mark a little bit. So thank you.
All right. Well, I know it's been long. Everyone's been in this warm room, but I did want just to give you an opportunity to say thank you to Mark. This is an important message and one that's under attack right now. Anything that smacks of diversity, equity, inclusion, of the beloved community, the family of creation, is now under siege. They're losing funding. Much of Mark's funding has dried up in his speaking engagements. And so he is so committed to this message that he has come tonight to just trusting in that when we come together as a group of people, that just asking for your support, that he can continue to do this work and cover his travel costs. So now we have this stunning opportunity to take action, to respond to Mark's provocative words, to practice a lived repentance, and to invest in this healing work of conciliation across our great divides. And so many of us who have a lot of privilege, those of us who have European ethnicity, one of the most impactful things that we can do is to leverage and share our collective assets, our resources, our time, and yes, our money. And so I know that you care deeply about this, or you wouldn't be here. And so we're asking you to put your money where your heart is for justice, and to value this collective we over just the I. And so I believe that when the community shows up, there's always an abundance. And I know that there's no doubt that most of us in this room can contribute tonight, whether that's a small amount of $10 or $20, or whether that's 50 or 100, or maybe you want to just invest in this important work right now and you want to give 200, 500, 1,000. We encourage you to be generous to our relative, our brother, uh, Mark Charles, in his message of healing. And so out in the lobby, as you go out, there's QR codes there. You can donate directly to his GoFundMe campaign. If you want to be tax deductible, you can donate to the church. There's a Venmo QR code right there. There's a jar for cash and checks. So we just ask that you give and give generously. Alone, we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And thank you for putting your bodies in this space. We're coming together. It means a lot and it gives us all hope. Thanks.
Want to give people like a 5-minute break to use the bathroom, and then if they want to come back, yeah, do that. Do a 5-minute break, and then come back and use the bathroom, and then
Okay,
yeah.
folks, we're gonna and this, oh, well, there you are. That's how you turn it on.
You can tell us Methodists don't have evening services like ever. We have like no lighting for this kind of thing. Yeah, that was on purpose.
All right, folks, we're going to start here in just a moment. Going to have Mark answer some questions. So if you want to come back in here and got some questions, we'll go ahead and get started in just a second. All right, folks. Okay. So we're going to, again, this is a time to ask Mark questions, to make statements, but to ask questions. So who's got a question? Okay. All right.
I have a quick one. How long are you going to be in this area? And could you meet with any of the other Indigenous elders of the area in the next few days, or can we do something online to promote your work?
Let me,
Thank you, by the way. very much.
Can you hear me this? Yeah, okay. So I am in town tonight. We flew in this morning to Portland, drove up today. I'm speaking in the Dales, I think is what it's called, the Dalles, on Saturday evening at an event there. And then I'm going to be in Portland on Sunday. So tomorrow, my daughter and I are going hiking up in the mountains. And then we're driving down to the Portland area on Saturday. And then on Sunday, I'm doing a few things in Portland and then flying home Monday morning. So I don't have a lot of, this trip came together fairly quickly recently. And so I didn't have a lot of planning time ahead of me, but I actually like to get back to this area several times a year. So I would be very open to finding a time to talk about setting up some meetings and having conversations on a future trip, even in maybe later in the fall or at the latest early next winter.
Is there, I don't know what's up.
Um,
If there is, just.
yeah,
let me
I
know.
do not know right now, unfortunately, but yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, who else? Working, there we are.
I really liked your whole talk. It's ironic though you mentioned your health and stuff, but I like how you interwove it into, talking to elders and things. There have been intersections in Christianity besides obviously what's happened to dehumanizing people, but also I grew up in, no, I chose to be evangelical at one point, and so I feel like there's these other intersections that I've tried to get away from. Like I have a trans son. I no longer do things for God type things, and so yes, I am getting to that question. How do I release my anger? And did you have anger? Because
Yeah.
I'm talking almost 20 years where I feel I should be over
Yeah.
how I'm feeling.
So like I said, and I appreciate that question, because I identify with completely, like, 'cause when I said earlier, I would go out during COVID and watch the sunrise and literally 5 minutes later be screaming at God, of not treating it like, look, God, you say you're about justice. I have a book of you bending over backwards to help Jewish people. I have years of church history of you allowing to act with impunity. I have precious on a global level for Black and brown people who aren't Jewish. Right. And just like, and don't tell me wait on the Lord. It's 2,000 years. That's at least a couple days. Right. And so I was just like, yeah, don't tell me wait on the Lord. Don't tell me. And it was out of that frustration of first of all, expressing it, but also I think being in the context of also communing very deeply with Creator. And for me, recognizing I was communing with Creator and screaming at the God of Abraham. And it's challenged me to think very critically about how do I relate to God? And at what point am I screaming at a God who is contained primarily in a book? And at what point am I building a healthy relationship with a God whose creation I'm walking in and I'm living in? And are the two the same? Are they not the same? And that's what's actually allowed me to go deeper into some of these questions and even express them publicly. I think one of the things I try very hard to do is I work very hard not to use my public stage as my own therapy couch. So I don't work through issues in front of people on stage. I express emotion. I'm not afraid to do that, but I work very hard to kind of to not surprise myself with emotion for the first time on stage, or to use the stage as a way to work through my emotions. And so what that means is I have to have a lot of intentional time, either just processing my own relationship with God, or of having people around me who I can talk to very honestly about these things with and work through them with. And so, yeah, but I would say, going all the way back to the story I just told you about the grandmother in the house and how those first few months on the reservation, I'm like, I don't know how to talk about this without screaming at people. And I don't know how, and so for me, that metaphor, I remember the first time I wrote that metaphor down, I read it and I'm like, that's it. That's exactly how I feel. And then I shared it with a neighbor on the reservation. And there was an elderly man. He said, I've lived here all my life, Mark. I've always struggled to express how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I took that metaphor to my non-native friends off the reservation and shared it with them. And instead of getting angry and defensive, they came back and they said, so how do we say thank you? Like, what does that look like to express gratitude to indigenous peoples? And that's where I'm like, now we're having a much better dialogue, because now we're not talking about victim versus oppressor, where you're the victor or I'm the victim and you're the oppressor. But now we're talking about this reversal of roles. And that actually gives me some agency to have some space in this conversation. And so for me, it was constantly looking for ways. So in my book, Unselling Truth, the 2 chapters on Lincoln, 9 and 10. Okay, you can get on, if you, there's a card back there, you can buy it from my website. You can get signed copies from my website. But those 2 chapters where I researched the white supremacy and genocidal policies of Abraham Lincoln, I had never seen those before. It took me 2 months to do the research. It took me another 6 months to wrestle with my own shame of how I had bought the lie for so long. And then another 3 months to figure out, how do I write this in a way where I'm not just screaming at people, or they're going to think I'm crazy, but how do I actually, and so, yeah, so much of my work is about, I mean, there's a reason we don't want to have these conversations. And there's another chapter in the book, it's chapter 11, right after Lincoln, where I go in depth about trauma and about how I need to be aware not only of the trauma of the people from the margins, the PTSD, the historical trauma, and those sorts of things, but even at what I call the trauma of white America, the perpetration-induced traumatic stress that the people who perpetrated these injustices are living with, for what they're standing on, and how do I deal with that? And so, yeah, this work has actually taken up a lot of my mental and emotional and physical